The avoidant is being tortured by thoughts of you, not occasionally, not just in quiet moments, constantly, invasively, overwhelmingly, every hour of every day, you're occupying their mental space in ways they can't control and can't escape. They wake up thinking about you. You're the last thought before they fall asleep. You intrude into their work, disrupting their concentration. You appear in their mind during conversations with other people, making them unable to be fully present. You're there when they're trying to distract themselves, when they're attempting to date someone new, when they're doing anything that should occupy their attention. The thoughts about you have become so constant, so consuming, so relentless, that they're making the avoidant's life unbearable. And the unbearable quality is intensified by the fact that they can't do anything about the thoughts. They can't reach out because vulnerability terrifies them. They can't process the thoughts with anyone because admitting them would contradict their entire identity. They can't make the thoughts stop through distraction or suppression because the thoughts are too powerful. The avoidant is trapped inside their own mind with obsessive thoughts about you, and the trapping is creating psychological suffering that's affecting every area of their functioning. What makes the thinking unbearable is that it's not just pleasant reminiscence or mild curiosity about how you're doing. The avoidant is thinking about you in ways that are painful, anxiety-inducing, and destabilizing. They're thinking about what they lost. They're replaying their mistakes. They're imagining conversations where they explain themselves or apologize or express what they couldn't express when you were together. They're wondering if you're thinking about them. They're creating elaborate theories about what you're doing and whether you've moved on. They're comparing everyone new to you and finding everyone lacking. They're analyzing every interaction you had, looking for moments where things could have gone differently. All of this thinking is creating constant psychological pain that the avoidant has no outlet for. The pain can't be expressed, can't be processed with others, can't be resolved through action. It just accumulates day after day, making the avoidant's internal experience increasingly unbearable. The unbearable quality of the thinking is also about the avoidant recognizing how much power you have over them through the thoughts. The avoidant built their entire identity on being independent, on not needing anyone, on being unbothered by relationship outcomes. But the constant thinking about you is undeniable evidence that they're not independent, they do need you, and they're extremely bothered by losing you. The thoughts are destroying the avoidant's self-concept. Every intrusive thought about you is proof that who they believe themselves to be is fiction. And sitting with the collapse of their identity, while being unable to do anything to restore it because restoration would require vulnerability they can't access, this is what's making the thinking unbearable. It's not just that they think about you constantly. It's that the thinking is forcing them to face truths about themselves they've spent their life denying. The intrusive quality of the thoughts they can't control. The thoughts about you are intrusive in ways the avoidant has never experienced with anyone else. Intrusive thoughts are thoughts that appear unwanted, that you can't control, that interrupt whatever you're trying to focus on. The avoidant is experiencing this with thoughts of you constantly. They'll be in a meeting at work, and suddenly they're thinking about the way you laughed at something they said 3 months ago. They'll be having a conversation with a friend, and they're actually thinking about whether you've started dating someone new. They'll be trying to fall asleep, and their mind is replaying the last conversation you had, analyzing every word for meanings they missed the first time. The intrusive quality means the thoughts aren't voluntary. The avoidant isn't choosing to think about you. The thoughts are choosing themselves, appearing without permission, consuming attention without invitation. The inability to control these thoughts is particularly disturbing to someone whose entire strategy for life has been control. The avoidant controls their emotions through suppression. They control their vulnerability through distance. They control relationships through withholding. But they cannot control thoughts about you. They've tried. They've attempted to redirect their attention, to force themselves to think about other things, to stay busy enough that there's no mental space for thoughts of you. But none of it works. The thoughts about you break through every defense, every distraction, every attempt at control. And the failure of control is creating anxiety, because if the avoidant can't control their own thoughts, what can they control? The intrusive thoughts are revealing that their control was always illusion, and the revelation is deeply destabilizing. The intrusive thoughts also have a repetitive quality that's making them unbearable. The avoidant isn't having new thoughts about you. They're having the same thoughts on loop, replaying the same scenes, rehashing the same regrets, asking themselves the same questions they can't answer. The repetition is creating mental exhaustion because there's no resolution, no progress, no movement forward. The thoughts just cycle endlessly, and the cycling is preventing the avoidant from thinking productively about anything else. Their mind is like a broken record stuck on you, and they can't move the needle to a different groove. The repetitive, intrusive thoughts are taking up so much cognitive capacity that the avoidant has nothing left for actual life tasks, for being present with people around them, for making forward progress in any domain. The intrusive thoughts are also coming at unpredictable times, which prevents the avoidant from ever feeling safe from them. If the thoughts only came at night, the avoidant could brace for them. But they come randomly, triggered by anything that remotely connects to you, or sometimes triggered by nothing discernible. A smell reminds them of you, and suddenly they're drowning in thoughts. A song plays, and they're back in a memory. They see someone who vaguely resembles you, and their whole day derails into thinking about you. The unpredictability means the avoidant is hypervigilant, always slightly on edge, never fully relaxed because they don't know when the next intrusive thought will ambush them. The hypervigilance is exhausting, and the exhaustion combined with the thoughts themselves is making daily functioning increasingly difficult. The specific content of the obsessive thinking. The avoidant is thinking about you in specific ways that reveal what they're struggling with most. They're thinking obsessively about their mistakes. Every moment they were cold when you needed warmth. Every time they withdrew when you reached for connection. Every instance they made you feel small for having normal needs. The mistakes replay in vivid detail, and with each replay comes a wave of shame and regret. The avoidant is torturing themselves with recognition of how they treated you, and the torture is unbearable because they can't undo anything, can't apologize adequately, can't make amends. The thinking is stuck on unchangeable past, creating pain without possibility of resolution. The avoidant is also thinking obsessively about what you're doing now. They imagine your daily life in elaborate detail. They wonder if you're happy, if you're sad, if you're angry at them, if you've moved on, if you're dating someone new. The wondering creates anxiety because they don't have actual information. They're filling in gaps with imagination, and imagination often creates worst-case scenarios. The avoidant imagines you with someone else who can give you what they couldn't. They imagine you being happier without them than you ever were with them. They imagine you not thinking about them at all while they think about you constantly. All of these imagined scenarios create pain and jealousy and fear, and the emotions are unbearable because they can't verify or disprove any of it. They're suffering from scenarios that might not even be real. The thinking also includes the avoidant constructing conversations with you that will never happen. They're writing speeches in their head about what they'd say if they had the chance. They're practicing apologies. They're crafting explanations for their behavior. They're imagining your responses and their counter-responses. Entire conversations unfold in the avoidant's mind. Conversations that feel real in the moment, but that exist only in imagination. And the imaginary conversations are making the real silence more painful because they're showing the avoidant exactly what they want: communication with you, explanation, understanding, reconciliation, while highlighting that they're too scared to pursue any of it in reality. The gap between what they're doing in their mind and what they're capable of doing in reality is unbearable. The avoidance thinking also obsessively compares everyone new to you. They're trying to date other people, or at least they're considering it, but everyone pales in comparison. The new person isn't as understanding as you were. They don't laugh at the same things. They don't create the same sense of safety. They don't accept the avoidance limitations the way you did. Every comparison reinforces that you were special, that what they had with you was rare, that they destroyed something irreplaceable. And these comparisons are making the thinking about you more painful because they're proving that the avoidant can't just replace you, can't find someone equivalent, might never find what they had with you again because what they had was specific to you and they destroyed it. The physical manifestations of the unbearable thinking. The constant thinking about you isn't just mental. It's creating physical symptoms that are making the avoidant's daily life increasingly difficult. They're experiencing anxiety symptoms, tightness in their chest when thoughts of you surface, racing heart when they imagine you with someone else, shallow breathing when they're replaying their mistakes. The anxiety is being triggered by thoughts rather than by external circumstances, which means it's with them constantly because the thoughts are constant. The avoidance body is in perpetual state of stress response, and the chronic stress is exhausting them physically, in addition to the mental exhaustion the thinking creates. The thinking is also affecting the avoidance sleep. They lie awake thinking about you. They have dreams about you that wake them up. They wake up in the morning and thoughts about you are immediately present. The sleep disruption is creating cumulative exhaustion that's affecting their functioning in every domain. They're tired at work. They're irritable with people around them. They're making mistakes because they can't concentrate. The sleep deprivation caused by thinking about you is creating a downward spiral where exhaustion makes emotional regulation harder, which intensifies the thoughts, which disrupts sleep more, which increases exhaustion. The cycle is making the thinking increasingly unbearable because the avoidant has no physical resources to manage it. The obsessive thinking is also affecting the avoidant's appetite and eating patterns. They're either eating too much to comfort themselves or too little because anxiety suppresses hunger. They're not enjoying food because they're too preoccupied with thoughts of you to taste what they're eating. They're using food dysregulation as one of many attempts to manage feelings they don't know how to process, and the dysregulation is creating additional physical discomfort that compounds the psychological discomfort the thinking creates. The avoidance body is suffering from their mind's obsession with you, and the suffering is visible in ways they can't hide. Weight changes, looking tired, seeming physically unwell. The thinking about you is also creating tension that manifests in the avoidance body. They're holding stress in their shoulders, their jaw, their neck. They're developing headaches from the constant mental activity and the tension it creates. They might be experiencing digestive issues from chronic stress. Their body is registering and manifesting the unbearable quality of the constant thinking, creating physical pain that mirrors and intensifies the psychological pain. The avoidant is learning that you can't obsessively think about someone without your body participating in the obsession, without the thinking creating comprehensive suffering that's mental, emotional, and physical simultaneously. The isolation created by unable to share the thinking. What makes the thinking about you truly unbearable is that the avoidant is alone with it. They can't talk to friends about the obsessive thoughts because talking would contradict their narrative of being fine, being over it, not needing anyone. They can't see a therapist because seeing a therapist would require admitting they need help, which contradicts their identity as independent and self-sufficient. They can't talk to you about what they're thinking because talking to you would require vulnerability that terrifies them. So the avoidant is trapped inside their own mind with thoughts that are consuming them, and they have no outlet, no way to process externally, no reality check from others, no support system. The isolation intensifies the unbearable quality because the thinking just loops internally without any external processing that might provide perspective or relief. The inability to share the thinking also means the avoidant is performing constantly when they're around others. They're pretending to be engaged in conversations while actually thinking about you. They're acting like they're fine while they're suffering internally. They're maintaining the facade of their identity as unbothered and independent while falling apart inside from obsessive thoughts they can't control. The performance is exhausting, adding to the unbearable quality of the thinking. The avoidant is not only dealing with constant thoughts about you, but also constantly working to hide those thoughts from everyone around them. The hiding requires enormous energy that the avoidant doesn't have because all their energy is being consumed by the thinking itself. The isolation also means the avoidant has no way to verify whether their thoughts about you are accurate. They're imagining what you're doing, what you're feeling, whether you've moved on. But they have no actual information, so imagination fills in gaps, and imagination often creates worst-case scenarios that may be completely wrong. If the avoidant could talk to someone who knows you, they might learn their worst fears are unfounded. If they could talk to you directly, they might discover that their imagined scenarios are inaccurate. But isolation means they're trapped with their own projections, unable to correct distorted thinking through reality testing. The isolation keeps the thinking as unbearable as it is because there's no external input to provide clarity or relief. The avoidant is also isolated from their own emotions in ways that make the thinking more unbearable. They're thinking constantly about you, but they can't let themselves fully feel what the thinking is bringing up. They can't cry about losing you because crying would be admitting vulnerability. They can't express anger about the situation because anger would require acknowledging they care. They can't talk about loneliness because loneliness contradicts independence. So the emotions the thinking generates have nowhere to go. They're trapped inside along with the thoughts, creating increasing internal pressure that has no release valve. The avoidant is isolated from support systems externally and isolated from their own emotional experience internally, and this double isolation is making the unbearable thinking completely unsustainable. The ways they try and fail to make the thinking stop. The avoidant is trying desperately to make the thinking about you stop, and every strategy is failing, which is making the unbearable situation worse because failure reinforces their powerlessness. They're trying distraction, staying constantly busy, filling every moment with activity, never allowing themselves to be alone with their thoughts. But the thoughts break through anyway. They intrude during the busiest moments. They surface the instant distraction ends. The avoidant discovers that you can't outrun your own thoughts, that busyness doesn't eliminate thinking, it just postpones it until you're so exhausted you have no resources to manage it. The avoidant is also trying suppression, actively forcing themselves not to think about you. But suppression creates rebound effect, where the suppressed thoughts come back stronger. The more the avoidant tries not to think about you, the more they think about you. It's like being told not to think about a white bear. The instruction guarantees thinking about exactly what you're trying not to think about. The failed suppression is making the avoidant feel increasingly powerless because they're using their primary coping mechanism, and it's not just failing, it's making things worse. The realization that their usual strategy is counterproductive is disturbing because it means they don't know how to handle what they're experiencing. The avoidant is trying to make the thinking stop by attempting to move on to someone new. They're dating, or at least trying to date, hoping that new romantic interest will displace thoughts of you. But the strategy fails completely because everyone they meet is compared to you and found wanting. The new person just highlights what the avoidant lost. Dating someone new doesn't stop thoughts about you. It intensifies them by making clear how unique you were, how good what they had with you was, how impossible it is to replace what they destroyed. The failed attempt to move on makes the thinking more unbearable because it proves you're not replaceable, which means the loss is irreversible, which makes the regret even more painful. The avoidant is also trying substances to numb the thinking. Alcohol, marijuana, possibly other drugs or addictive behaviors are being used to create mental escape from constant thoughts of you. And substances work temporarily. They provide hours of not thinking so clearly, of feelings being muted, of obsessive thoughts being somewhat quieted, but the relief is temporary and the cost is high. The substances don't eliminate the thinking, they just postpone it. And when the avoidant sobers up, the thoughts return with full force, often intensified by the depressive effects of the substance. The substance use is also creating new problems: potential addiction, poor decisions while intoxicated, damage to health and relationships that compound the unbearable quality of the thinking by adding new sources of distress. The realization that thinking is revealing their attachment. What's making the thinking particularly unbearable is the avoidant's growing recognition of what the thinking means. They're deeply attached to you in ways they've been denying. The constant thinking is undeniable evidence of attachment. You can't think obsessively about someone you're not attached to. You can't have someone intrude into your thoughts constantly if they don't matter to you. You can't be unable to move on if you weren't actually deeply bonded. The thinking is forcing the avoidant to confront that everything they told themselves about not needing anyone, about being fine alone, about not being affected by relationships was lie. They're profoundly affected. They did need you. They're not fine without you. And these realizations are threatening their entire identity. The avoidant is also realizing through the thinking that they loved you, probably love you still. And this realization is unbearable because it makes everything they did, withdrawing, being cold, eventually losing you, into greater tragedy. If they didn't love you, the loss would be easier to bear. But they did love you, which means they destroyed something precious, not because it wasn't valuable, but because they were too scared to keep it. The thinking is forcing recognition that fear destroyed love, that defense mechanisms eliminated the exact thing the avoidant actually wanted, that their patterns cost them the relationship that mattered most. Understanding this through constant thinking about you is creating grief so profound the avoidant has no capacity to process it. The unbearable thinking is also revealing to the avoidant that they need people more than their identity allows for. The avoidant has built identity on not needing anyone, but obsessive thoughts about one specific person prove that they do need, they do attach, they do depend on others for emotional well-being. The thinking is destroying the fundamental story the avoidant has told about themselves. They're not the independent person they thought they were. They're not above human need for connection. They're just a regular person with attachment needs, who's been denying those needs, and who's now suffering the consequences of the denial. The identity collapse that the thinking is causing is making the thinking unbearable, because the avoidant doesn't know who they are if they're not the independent one. The thinking is also revealing to the avoidant that you had more power in the relationship than they believed. The avoidant thought they had the power through being less attached, less invested, less affected, but the constant thinking proves you have enormous power over them. You occupy their mental space without trying. You affect their emotional state without being present. You control their attention without any effort. The power was never where the avoidant thought it was. You had it all along through being genuinely valuable to them, and they're recognizing this too late after they've lost you, when the recognition can only create pain without creating any possibility of correction or reconnection, the tipping point where unbearable becomes transformation or breakdown. The thinking about you has become so unbearable that the avoidant is reaching a tipping point. Something has to give. Either the unbearable thinking drives them toward transformation, getting therapy, doing the work to heal their attachment wounds, becoming capable of vulnerability, or it drives them toward breakdown where their functioning collapses completely. The tipping point is dangerous territory. The avoidant is closer to needing serious help than they've ever been. The question is whether the pain will motivate growth or whether it will just break them in ways that make growth even less accessible. Transformation is possible but rare. It requires the avoidant using the unbearable thinking as wake-up call. The thinking is teaching them they can't continue living the way they've been living. Their patterns don't work. Their defenses don't protect them. Their avoidance of vulnerability just creates different and worse pain than vulnerability itself would create. If the avoidant can hear these lessons, if the unbearable quality of the thinking motivates them to finally seek professional help and commit to the difficult work of changing, the unbearable period could be the turning point that saves them. But transformation requires the avoidant to do things that still terrify them. Admit they need help, be vulnerable with a therapist, face painful emotions they've avoided their whole life. Most avoidants can't do these things even when the alternative is unbearable thinking that's destroying their quality of life. Breakdown is more likely than transformation for most avoidants because breakdown is passive while transformation is active. Breakdown is what happens when the avoidant doesn't do anything to address the unbearable thinking, when they just keep suffering without seeking help, when the thinking overwhelms their capacity to function. Breakdown looks like unable to work, unable to maintain relationships, unable to care for themselves properly, potentially hospitalization if things get severe enough. The avoidant sliding toward breakdown is someone whose life is coming apart because obsessive thoughts about you combined with inability to do anything about those thoughts is exceeding their psychological capacity to manage. Breakdown is failure of all their defenses, collapse of all their functioning, the avoidant finally being forced to get help, not because they choose to, but because they have no other option. Some avoidants will hover between transformation and breakdown indefinitely, getting close to seeking help when pain is acute, then pulling back when pain becomes chronic and manageable. They'll live with unbearable thinking about you indefinitely, never unbearable enough to force them into real change, never bearable enough to allow them quality of life. This middle zone is its own kind of torture. Permanent half-life where the avoidant is thinking about you constantly, suffering constantly, but never suffering enough to overcome their fear of vulnerability enough to get help. Years can pass in this state, years where the avoidant is consumed by thoughts of you, making them unable to fully engage with life, but not desperate enough to do what transformation requires. What you should understand about their unbearable thinking. Understanding that the avoidant is thinking about you so much it's unbearable should be validating. It confirms the relationship mattered, that you weren't alone in feeling deeply, that what you experienced was mutual even if it wasn't functionally reciprocated. The validation is important for your healing, for not questioning your perception of the connection, for recognizing that the problem was their inability to translate feelings into functional relationship rather than absence of feelings. But validation shouldn't change your boundaries. The avoidant thinking about you constantly while remaining unable or unwilling to reach out, to be vulnerable, to do their work, doesn't create any reason for you to be available to them. You should also understand that their unbearable thinking isn't your responsibility. You didn't cause it by leaving or by enforcing boundaries. You caused it by being someone genuinely valuable who they lost through their own patterns. The thinking is appropriate response to losing something precious. The unbearable quality is the avoidant finally experiencing consequences for patterns they've maintained for years. You're not responsible for relieving their suffering by making yourself available again, by accepting their limitations, by sacrificing your needs. Their suffering is theirs to manage, ideally through getting professional help and doing the work to be different. Understanding their thinking should also reinforce why you can't wait for them. The avoidant thinking about you constantly doesn't mean they're any closer to being ready for healthy relationship. Thinking isn't the same as growing. Suffering isn't the same as changing. They can think about you obsessively for years while remaining incapable of the vulnerability and consistency that partnership requires. If they reach out, if they express wanting to try again, the question isn't whether they've been thinking about you, of course they have, but whether they've been doing the therapeutic work to become different. Thinking alone doesn't create capacity. Only sustained therapeutic work creates capacity, and most avoidants won't do that work no matter how unbearable their thinking becomes. The avoidant is thinking about you so much it's becoming unbearable, and the unbearable quality is their experience of finally facing what their patterns cost them. They're suffering from obsessive thoughts they can't control, thoughts that are revealing their attachment to you, destroying their identity as independent, creating physical and mental anguish, isolating them from support, and driving them toward either transformation or breakdown. The thinking is comprehensive suffering, and the suffering is entirely self-created through patterns the avoidant maintained, despite every warning, despite your patience, despite opportunities to be different.